Good evening, everybody. My name is Marcus Rayer. I'm Chartered Independent Financial Advisor for Integrity 365. Thank you very much for joining us this evening for a very topical webinar. I'm very pleased that we are joined this evening by Stephen McPhillips from Dentons Pensions. So I'm sure you're here for varying reasons, but the subject this evening is pensions. Hopefully you've been involved with some of our other webinars that we've had in the series, and some of you may even notice Stephen from before. Stephen and I have held a webinar once previously. So if you do have a chance, please do look through the company website. You'll be able to look at past webinars that we've done. We do have some more planned as well. So please do check those out. I would now like to introduce Stephen. And Stephen, if you'd like to carry on, please.
Thank you very much indeed, Marcus, and good evening. As Marcus mentioned, my name is Stephen McPhillips. I'm Dentons Technical Sales Director, and part of my role there, and as Dentons Technical Sales Director, is provide technical help and support to financial advisors and their support staff. And we're delighted to be working in partnership with Integrity 365 again this evening for this webinar. We've called it Pensions Lifetime Allowance. Now you see it, now you don't, because as you may or may not be aware from the spring 2023 budget, one of the large announcements that came out of that related to the Pensions Lifetime Allowance. So we're going to cover that this evening for you and hopefully give you some background. We'll look at it in relation to self-invested pensions, which is what we do as a business, self-invested personal pensions and small self-administered schemes. But hopefully it's topical, as Marcus mentioned, because announcements were made about this in the budget. One thing I need to just stress before we go any further is that I can't give any financial or investment advice, and nor can any of my colleagues in Dentons Pensions. We're not authorised or regulated to give you financial or pensions advice. But what we can do is provide you with factual information on Dentons products and services, and factual information in relation to pensions legislation. Any advice matters would then fall on Marcus's shoulders and his colleagues in Integrity 365, but just need to be clear that we're not financial advisors ourselves in Dentons Pensions. So what I'll do now is I shall share my screen with you, and I will also disappear at this point and come back on at the end when Marcus invites us back on for the questions and answers. So what we're going to do is we'll start by looking at today's learning objectives, just so that you know what we're going to cover. And you'll see from those learning objectives that we're going to speak. We'll try to understand the background to it, and also we'll look at various forms of protection against the lifetime allowance you may have previously registered for or may be thinking about registering for now. So we'll concentrate on the lifetime allowance. We'll also touch on the annual allowance. Today's session, it's fairly and squarely on the lifetime allowance. We're going to look at where the lifetime allowance came from, because in order to understand where we are now, we need to understand where we've been previously. So we'll look at the background to the lifetime allowance, and I'll give you a brief summary of the various forms of protection that are available or have been available to pension scheme members since the lifetime allowance was introduced. We're going to also cover the spring budget from a few weeks ago, because that has important implications for pension scheme members. And we'll talk about something called benefit crystallisation events. I'll explain what those are later on in the presentation, but the lifetime allowance and benefit crystallisation events go hand in hand currently. And then we'll round off with some potential planning questions that you may have for your financial advisors. And Marcus will then lead a Q&A session at the end. So that's what we're going to cover by way of the agenda. So let's then begin by looking at the background to the lifetime allowance. It hasn't always been around in pensions. It was actually introduced on the 6th of April 2006. That was called, within our industry, it was called Pensions AD, or it was also sometimes called Pensions Simplification. So it only existed, the lifetime allowance only existed from 6th of April 2006 onwards. And it was part and parcel of this package of measures to simplify pensions, because up until that point in time, you could have been a pension scheme member, or you could have been involved in several pension schemes, and you could have been in any one or more of 8 different so-called pension environments or benefit regimes. And those different environments related to what type of pension scheme you were in, whether it was a company pension scheme or a personal pension. Within the company pension environment, it mattered when you joined that scheme. For example, if you joined it before a certain day in 1987, you had one set of rules applying to you. If you joined that scheme after a certain day in 1987, a different set of rules applied for you. And then again in 1989 when the rules changed. And in some cases, we had a cap on your earnings for the calculation of tax-free lump sums, but not pensions. So there's a whole range of different types of arrangement pension scheme members could be in, and they could be in several of them at the one time. So Simplicity wanted to address that, address the different rules that applied for company-sponsored pension schemes and personal pension schemes. And the way that uniformity was achieved was that a uniform set of rules was brought into place to allow for the same tax relievable pension contributions into company pension schemes and other types of pension schemes, personal pensions. Incidentally, we're not talking today about final salary type company pension schemes. We're talking about ones where you as a scheme member take the investment risk. That investment risk isn't met by the trustees of a final salary scheme. Money goes into the scheme on your behalf, and it grows to a certain amount over the period of your lifetime savings in the pension scheme, and that will produce a pot of money or a fund at your retirement date at which you can then choose to take benefits from. Final salary schemes are quite different from that, and we're not talking about these this afternoon in the webinar. So pension simplification was well intentioned because it brought uniformity on the amount of money that could be paid into a pension scheme in a tax relievable manner, and also uniformity about the types of benefits you could take out at the other end. We swept away to a large extent these different 8 different benefit environments that people could be members of. And pension simplification brought to us 2 new concepts: the lifetime allowance that we're going to focus on today. And the lifetime allowance is the overall pot of money, tax advantage money, that you can accrue through your working lifetime. Okay, the overall pot of money that you can have that isn't subject to additional tax charges. The annual allowance is something completely separate. The annual allowance is the limit on the amount of tax relievable pension contributions a person can pay into a scheme on their own behalf, or an employer can pay in on their own behalf to the scheme. So that's an annual amount, an annual limit on the amount of money that can go into a pension scheme in a tax relievable manner. The lifetime allowance is an overall limit on the overall pot of money that you can accumulate during your lifetime. So yeah, that's what we've just discussed there. The lifetime allowance hasn't been with us all the time. It was only introduced in 2006. It took away a lot of complexity that existed in pensions before then, and we got 2 new concepts brought into the pensions world: the lifetime allowance and the annual allowance. Okay, and we're going to focus on the lifetime allowance. Now, the first thing to recognise about the lifetime allowance is that that figure has changed quite dramatically over the years. It started off at £1.5 million in 2006, and we had a pre-announced, pre-programmed series of increases over the following 5 years. So we knew in advance that the lifetime allowance started at 1.5 million, but it was programmed to peak at 1.8 million pounds in the 2010-2011 tax year, as you'll see from the bar chart there. Actually, it was maintained at 1.8 million pounds in the 2011-2012 tax year as well. But thereafter, changes were made to the lifetime allowance, and it started to be revised downwards. Okay, so it's not something that stayed static over the years. The lifetime allowance has changed over a period of time, and over recent years it's been constant at a figure of 1.0731 million pounds. Okay, it seems like a very random figure, but it was relating to the fact that the lifetime allowance was going to change in line with the retail price index or consumer price index. So that's why we've got a seemingly odd number these at the moment, 1.0731 million. But the important thing to say as well in relation to this slide is that each time the revisions have been downwards, there's been an opportunity for pension scheme members to protect their position at the previous level before the rules changed. So as we said, it started at £1.5 million in 2006, peaked at 1.8 million, and it's currently 1.0731 million. But as I said, each time the lifetime allowance was revised downwards, the government, HM Treasury and HMRC gave scheme members an opportunity to protect their position. So if you had a £1.5 million lifetime allowance, which you would have done in 2006 in certain circumstances, or sorry, £1.8 million in 2010, 2011, when it dropped, you were able to lock in and keep that £1.8 million lifetime allowance by applying to HMRC for what's called lifetime allowance protection. So although the rules changed and the lifetime allowance figure dropped, people were still able to, in the right circumstances, were still able to keep the previous figure that had applied because it's saved in good faith up to that point in time before the pension rules changed. So because of the various changes that have happened over the years, there's various forms of lifetime allowance protection that now exist. And their interaction with each other can be quite complex. Some forms of protection you can have in conjunction with others, some you can't have in conjunction with others, and some of those forms of protection meant that you could no longer have new money paid into pension schemes for you or accrue benefits, but some allowed you to have new contributions paid in or to accrue new benefits. So the whole system, despite being part of pension simplification, in itself got quite complicated. And I've been saying for all the years I've been in the industry, clients need financial advice, specialist financial planning advice around pensions more and more than ever because of the complexity of the rules that exist. But these complexities arise because each time a substantial change happens to pensions, typically the government doesn't want somebody to be disadvantaged by that change because they've saved in good faith up to that point in time when there are a certain given set of rules saved in good faith. The rules then change, but their position isn't adversely affected by that. They call it grandfathering within the pensions world, looking after your existing arrangements before the pension rules changed. So we mentioned lifetime allowance protection. So let's then look at what some of those protections are. You'll be pleased to know probably we're not going to go into any of these in great detail. It's just to highlight them to you because you may have taken advantage of one of these or more of these over the years. So primary protection is one form of lifetime allowance protection that gave a client a personalised lifetime allowance figure specific to them. Something called enhanced protection was also available from day one. These were back in 2006. And with enhanced protection, your fund value is protected at whatever value it ended up growing to over your lifetime. So if the fund value grew to £10 million, you weren't going to be affected by a lifetime allowance tax charge because you had applied for enhanced protection. But one of the requirements that came with enhanced protection is that no new pension contributions could be paid in for you after April 2006. Then, because of the changes over the lifetime allowance in subsequent years, we had different forms of protection at different times. Fixed protection 2012 came along in 2012, which protected a client's lifetime allowance at £1.8 million, but no new contributions could be paid. Another form came along in 2014, protecting your lifetime allowance at £1.5 million. Another one came along in 2016, protecting your value at £1.25 million, and no contributions again possible there. And then two different forms of protection came around in 2014 and 2016 called individual protection. And with individual protection, you were able to have new pension contributions paid into you, or you were able to have new benefits accrue within a pension scheme, unlike the fixed protection ones. So those all existed in the past. There are only two forms of protection open to new applications, unless someone makes a belated application for one of the earlier ones. And the two that are still open to members these days are fixed protection 2016, which up until recently, you couldn't have any new pension contributions paid in for you if you applied for that, and that protects your lifetime allowance at 1.25 million, or individual protection 2016, which protected your fund value at somewhere between 1 million and 1.25 million, depending on how much you had in your pot. But you did have to have £1 million of a pension pot accrued by the 6th of April 2016 to be able to apply for individual protection 2016. So some of these are historic lifetime allowance protections, but the lifetime allowance protections are still important in the context of things, because they dictate whether or not you will be subject to a tax charge when you start to take your benefits from the scheme, or if or when death benefits are payable out of the scheme. So although there was talk of changes in the spring 2023 budget about the lifetime allowance being abolished itself, that hasn't actually happened. The lifetime allowance hasn't been abolished as we currently speak. There's a proposal to abolish it from the 6th of April 2024, but in the meantime, the lifetime allowance still exists, and if you have any forms of protection against it, or you apply for fixed or individual protection 2016, they could still be valuable to you as a pension scheme member, because the crucial thing here that I'm stressing is that lifetime allowance itself has not been abolished as a result of the spring 2023 budget. Okay, well, things did change then when the budget came along, because these lifetime allowance protections, as we said, no new contributions were payable in respect of quite a lot of those protections. One of the proposals that has come forward in the spring 2023 budget is that you can actually start to have new contributions paid in for you, or accrue new pension benefits, even if you have these protections which previously prohibited you from having new pension contributions paid in for you. So that all changed potentially as a result of the spring budget on the 15th of April 2023. I don't know if any of you managed to sit down and watch the Chancellor of the Exchequer announce the budget that day, but he did so on the 15th of March. And some of the information that came out with the spring budget in relation to pensions was somewhat of a surprise to us within the industry. So what were the headline aspects from the spring budget in relation to pension planning? Well, it's proposed, because the budget announcements are proposals rather than being solid legislation at this stage, it's proposed that there'll be no lifetime allowance tax charge in this tax year that we are in now. So from the 6th of April 2023 to the 5th of April 2024, it's been proposed that no lifetime allowance tax charge arises. And by that, I mean, if you've got a fund that exceeds your available lifetime allowance, if you don't have forms of protection to protect you from that, if your fund exceeds the lifetime allowance, historically, you've had to pay a lifetime allowance tax charge. The proposal is, in this current tax year, the lifetime allowance tax charge is actually 0, rather than 25% or 55%, depending on your circumstances. The second proposal, as I mentioned, is that there be complete abolition of the lifetime allowance from the 6th of April 2024. So the lifetime allowance still exists in this current tax year that we're in. We still have to do calculations to check against a member's available lifetime allowance, because it hasn't been abolished as yet. And it will take further legislation to bring about the complete abolition of the lifetime allowance from the 6th of April 2024. Still a proposal at this stage only. Separately, which not relating to the lifetime allowance, but we mentioned the annual allowance earlier, the Chancellor also announced that the annual allowance was going to increase from £40,000 per annum to £60,000 per annum. And he also announced that the money purchase annual allowance was going to increase from £4,000 to £10,000, and the tapered annual allowance would increase from £4,000 to £10,000 as well. Those are two constraints on the amount of money that can be paid in to a pension scheme in a tax relievable manner, and they will only apply in certain circumstances. For example, the tapered annual allowance will only apply to you if you have substantial earnings, because the tapered annual allowance is meant to restrict the amount of tax relievable pension contributions that a very high earner can pay into a pension scheme. As I said, tonight we're focusing on the lifetime allowance, but I mentioned these for completeness sake, because they were part of the budget announcements. So those were the kind of high-level announcements. The additional detail that always comes out in the wash after a budget, we've got a lot of that detail now. And as I said, the lifetime allowance tax charge in the 2023-24 current tax year is going to be set at 0%. Now, previously, as I mentioned, that the lifetime allowance tax charge would either be 55% if you took the excess above the lifetime allowance as a lump sum, or it was taxed at 25% if you didn't take the excess as a lump sum, but you took it as an ongoing income from the pot. So 55% tax reduced to 0% tax potentially, depending on your circumstances, because the lifetime allowance tax charge this year is going to be set at 0. However, some payments to scheme members or beneficiaries will instead be taxed at the recipient's marginal rate of tax. So whatever rate of tax that person is paying at the current time when the money is received, that some of the excess above the lifetime allowance will be taxed at that level. And you'll see on the screen there, serious ill health lump sums will be taxed at the recipient's marginal rate. By that, I mean the part above the member's available lifetime allowance. If you've got uncrystallised funds, i.e. those that you've not started to take benefit from a scheme, and a lump sum death benefit is paid from those, that will be taxed at the recipient's marginal rate if it's above the lifetime allowance as well. Defined benefit lump sum death benefit payments, and also any excess above the lifetime allowance lump sums. Instead of being taxed at 55 or 25%, these will be taxed at the recipient's marginal rate. Now that could be 0. If the recipient's current rate of tax is 0, then the benefit payments to them may not be subject to tax at all, as opposed to previously 55 or 25%. But it does depend on those circumstances, on those 4 points listed there. It depends what the recipient's marginal tax rate is at the time the money is paid to them. We also found out in additional detail that the maximum tax-free lump sum or pension commencement lump sum that members can take from 6th of April 2023 is going to be capped at £268,275. Now that sounds like a figure that may have been plucked from thin air. It hasn't. That happens to be 25% of the current lifetime allowance. 1.0731 million, 25% of that is £268,275. So that's the maximum tax-free lump sum that members can take from pension schemes from the 6th of April 2023, unless those scheme members have a higher tax-free lump sum entitlements or protections relating from previous membership of the pension scheme. People who've got protected tax-free lump sums are able to retain those protections and won't be limited to the £268,275 figure that I mentioned earlier. And another important aspect here to say is that as a result of the additional detail that's come out of the budget, someone's pension commencement lump sum or tax-free lump sum entitlement historically within a personal pension world has been seen to be 25% of the fund value. Because of these changes now, it's not a straightforward, it's not a given that your tax-free lump sum entitlement will be 25% of the fund. It may actually end up being smaller or lower than 25% of the fund. Again, clients need to speak to the financial advisors to understand the real detail of that and how it might impact on their pension planning now and in the future. So that was some of the additional detail that came out of the budget. We spoke about this aspect earlier about benefit crystallisation events, and I said that that's something that happens when a member starts to decide that they want to start to access some of the money that's been in their pension scheme, saving for them for their retirement. You tell your provider that you want to start taking benefits, and in the pensions parlance that we have these days, that's called a benefit crystallisation event. You're starting to crystallise your pot of money and take some or all of the benefits. So a benefit crystallisation event is broadly where the pension provider must test the value of your benefits in the scheme against your available lifetime allowance. So we've talked about lifetime allowance. The question really in your mind then might be, well, when does it ever come into play? Well, it comes into play when you start to take benefits or crystallise benefits in the pension arrangement. The pension provider has to test your fund value against your available lifetime allowance. And what will come into play here is whether you've got any protections against the lifetime allowance and what the current lifetime allowance is in the year in which you start to take benefits, or in subsequent years when you take benefits as well. Now, bear in mind, I've said that the lifetime allowance itself is not being abolished as yet. It's going to take until 6th of April 2024 until it's actually abolished. So we still, when we're doing these benefit crystallisation event calculations with clients, we still have to test their benefits against the person's available lifetime allowance. Okay, so that happens when you first start to take your benefits under the scheme, but as the rules stand currently, your benefits your fund value will also be retested against the lifetime allowance at the time you reach your 75th birthday, so if you survive through to 75. So there's two places where your pension fund is tested against the lifetime allowance: when you first start to take benefits, and then eventually, once again, at age 75, as the rules stand currently. And that's just really what that slide's saying. Your benefits are tested twice, and even though you may have been under the lifetime allowance when you first took your benefits, if you've had really good investment growth, by the time you reach your 75th birthday, that may have pushed your fund above the lifetime allowance at that point. And so even though you didn't pay a lifetime allowance tax charge or were subject to a lifetime allowance tax charge when you first took your benefits, you may be subject to a lifetime allowance tax charge further down the line at age 75, as the rules currently stand. We still need to see more detail about this. Incidentally, the legislation to bring about the spring budget changes is making its way through Parliament now. It's at the committee stage in the House of Commons. Has to go through various stages before it eventually is passed into law, and we expect that the Finance Number 2 bill, which is what's going to bring about the spring budget changes, we expect that that will be passed through royal assent into law towards the end of June this year. We can see on the government website, what stages it's at. We just don't know exactly when royal assent will be given to it. We expect it in June. So more detail, I think personally, to come out of the budget. So where does all of that leave us then? I appreciate we've spoken about quite a lot of complexity there. Where do the spring budget 2023 changes leave us? Well, these aren't questions that I can answer for you. These are questions that you may want to pick up with your financial advisor. But one of them might be, should I crystallise benefits now? Start to take benefits if I'm over the lifetime allowance. Bear in mind that the proposal is that if you've got benefits above the lifetime allowance tax charge won't be 55% now, it won't be 25%. In some cases, you won't pay a lifetime allowance tax charge, or in some cases, your beneficiaries or you may pay a charge at your marginal rate. So it's a legitimate question to ask, should I start to take benefits now if I'm over the lifetime allowance in light of the budget announcements? Another potential question that you may want to pose is, if you've already crystallised part of your pension pot, which some people may have done, should I crystallise the balance now that I'm over the lifetime allowance? Again, bearing in mind that the lifetime allowance tax charge has been reduced to zero, it's a legitimate question to ask, should you crystallise any benefits in excess of the lifetime allowance now in light of that that proposed change in the rules? Another one is, if you're over the lifetime allowance, should you crystallise and take the excess as a lump sum? So the excess above the lifetime allowance, should you take it as a lump sum, or should you what's called designate it to drawdown? Should you say, okay, I'll leave that money in the pot and I'll just draw income down from it as and when my circumstances dictate? That's a perfectly valid question to ask, because that may dictate whether or not you pay a lifetime allowance tax charge of any kind when you start to take the benefits. Another potential question to ask in light of what we've heard already, if you have benefited from enhanced or fixed protections in the past and you've been prohibited from making any future pension contributions because you would lose those protections, given we've been told that you will no longer lose those protections as a result of the spring budget, should you recommence, or should your employer recommence pension contributions if you have enhanced or fixed protection? Bear in mind, we said earlier on, if you've got enhanced protection, one of the provisos that came with that was that you couldn't make any new contributions to schemes, or your employer couldn't, or you couldn't build up benefits in the scheme. That's a question now, in light of the changes, you may well want to put to your advisor, should I restart these? And also, should you consider registering for fixed protection 2016 or individual protection 2016? These are still open for application to HMRC. All the others are closed. These are still open. So the question is whether you should or you shouldn't think about registering for these. But bear in mind that the lifetime allowance still exists. Your benefits are still tested against the lifetime allowance. So fixed protection at 2016 or individual protection 2016 offer you a fixed level of lifetime allowance that you may not otherwise get. Then there may be valid reasons why you might think about registering for fixed protection or individual protection 2016. As I said, these are questions that we can't answer for you in Dentons Pensions. It's something that your financial advisor will look to do in terms of the overall financial planning advice, pension planning advice they give you, and the review with you on an ongoing basis. And there may well be more questions that have sprung to mind as we've gone through this, and we may deal with some of those now in the question and answer section. Just before we go on to that, just a quick look back at the learning objectives. Hopefully we've covered those off to a greater or lesser extent for you. We've looked at the lifetime allowance, where it came from. We've looked at how various forms of protection from the lifetime allowance. We've talked about what a benefit crystallisation event is, and we've also looked at the importance of age 75 when your benefits are retested against the lifetime allowance as things currently stand, and we've looked at some questions. So with that, I'll hand you back to Marcus now to see if there are any questions arising from this.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Very insightful, and I'm sure our attendees, find that very interesting, and hopefully it's answered some of their questions. So yeah, thank you once again, Stephen, for that. I've had a few questions come through from some of the attendees. One of which I think is quite topical at the moment. Obviously, we've seen a pretty large landslide in the local elections recently, and we have had a question from one of our attendees, which I'll just read out to you now. Assuming Labour win the next general election, do you think they will allow individuals who save in good faith, assuming no upper limit to the lifetime allowance, to have protection, should they choose to reinstate a lower limit to the lifetime allowance?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and there certainly has been speculation about that in the press, and I understand that Labour have actually stated, in response to the budget, they have stated that they would reinstate the lifetime allowance. It's politics or political questions I can't really get into from Denton's perspective, but certainly it's a good question, and it's certainly something that has been already flagged up by people around the country when Labour said that they would look to reinstate the lifetime allowance. The only thing I can say really in relation to that, and it's not a political comment whatsoever, is that as we saw earlier in the presentation, typically what's happened in the past, when the government have changed the pension rules and they've changed them potentially to the detriment of scheme members, typically the government have enabled scheme members to protect their position because they had saved in good faith up to that point in time. So if that was borne out in future within pensions legislation, one would like to think therefore that any things that happen now before the rules change under a future government, hopefully anything that happens now will stand good and not be affected by changes further down the line, regardless of which party is in power further down and which party makes the changes. Yeah,
and I'd just reiterate that I think it's very important for each individual to discuss their individual circumstances with their financial advisor and address those questions such as, is it worth you considering fixed protection 2016 and individual protection 2016? Have those conversations with your advisor. Even though we're still waiting, on the royal assent for this legislation to pass, if it does get reversed, it may well be worth, having applied for those protections. So discuss your individual requirements with your advisor and make sure you're taking the right course of action. Thank you for that, Stephen. One other question I've had from an attendee is, does the pension allowance relate to just my own contributions or both my employer and mine together?
Yeah, okay, that's a good question as well. So here we're not talking about the lifetime allowance here particularly. I think the questioner might be asking about the annual allowance.
Yeah.
So as we said earlier, the annual allowance is the maximum tax relievable pension contribution that can be paid into a scheme in any given year. It's been increased to £60,000 as a result of the spring budget. That £60,000 limit applies to both employer and employee contributions into the scheme. So it catches everything. It's not just limited to a personal contribution into the scheme being limited to £60,000. It's a combination of both employer and employee. And if you breach the annual allowance, whether it's employer and employee, then there would be annual allowance tax charges to suffer there as well in any given year. So it applies to both.
Thank you. One question here, I think we did refer to the answers with this within the presentation, but I'll ask the question anyway because it's been raised. So will I be able to take more tax-free cash as there is no more lifetime allowance?
Right, okay, yeah, that is a good question. Well, the government seems to have anticipated the fact that there's no more lifetime allowance. It potentially means that people can get a much higher tax-free lump sum entitlement. And consequently, what they've done is they've capped the maximum tax-free lump sum or pension commencement lump sum at 25% of 1.0731 million from the 6th of April. So even if the lifetime allowance is abolished next year, 6th of April next year, actually they've taken steps to ensure that people's tax-free lump sum entitlement is capped at 25% of 1.0731 million.
Yeah.
But as we said earlier, if you have got forms of protection that have protected your tax-free lump sum a much higher figure, then those forms of protection still apply.
Absolutely. Thank you. One other question here. So as the current lifetime allowance is abolished, I think we just need to caveat that it's not currently yet abolished. Does that mean it makes it easier to have a commercial property in the SIPP as the or SIPP or SAS, obviously via Dentons, hopefully, as the value can grow a lot more without the risk of a charge?
Yeah, again, a very good question. If there's no upper limit on the amount of pension pot you can accrue, then in theory, there's no worry then about an asset like a commercial property really going through the roof in value, because if the lifetime allowance is abolished, you've no longer got to worry about hitting that ceiling of reaching your available lifetime allowance and paying tax charges in addition to that. So in theory, that would be the case. But again, just stress that the lifetime allowance itself has not actually been abolished as we currently sit here this evening. And if it is going to be abolished, it will be abolished only from the 6th of April 2024, assuming all things are equal. But if it is abolished, then I understand the questioner's point of view there. If there's no lifetime allowance, no upper limit you've got to worry about, then a commercial property growing in value, the more it grows in value, the more it will benefit you and your pension scheme, and the less likely you are in future to suffer a tax charge as a result of receiving exceptionally good growth. As I said earlier, one of the things that is still unclear, as far as I'm concerned at the moment, is whether or not benefits are going to be retested again on the member's 75th birthday. If that requirement or some kind of requirement relating to that or similar to that happens, then you would still have a potential issue about an asset, worrying about an asset growing too strongly over the course of your lifetime, because you might still hit this upper limit. We just don't know yet exactly how things are going to look, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's fine, Stephen. And there have been another couple of questions regarding kind of political matters, of course, which we're not really able to comment on. So yes, there may be things that might get reversed, but we can't possibly comment on such matters at this time. So it's important to work within the current guidelines and legislation that's been set out, work closely with your advisor, legislate for what we can at the moment. If things change, then we adapt your financial plan accordingly. But I can't stress it enough. It's very important to have that conversation with your advisor and establish whether applying for some sort of protection, given your circumstances, is a viable route for you to follow. And yeah, I think that's the majority of the questions that have come through. If there are any attendees on the webinar this evening who have got additional questions, and perhaps you've not wanted to type them in, or you do have any questions, please do contact myself or your advisor at Integrity 365, and we'll gladly address those questions for you. But hopefully you've all benefited from your attendance this evening at the webinar. I would very much like to thank Stephen for his time this evening, and indeed all of you yourselves who have attended this evening and taken time out of your evenings in which to join us. As I mentioned earlier, please do keep an eye out for the recordings hitting your inbox in due course. The webinar will also be available via our website. And with that, I would like to say thank you very much for joining us this evening. Thank you again to Stephen, and we'll leave things there for now.
Thank you, Marcus.
Stephen, thank you all. Thank you.